There is a gate mark on the base of certain cast iron pans. A thin raised line, straight across the bottom, left by the way foundries poured iron before 1890. Foundries stopped doing it because it was slower. Collectors started hunting for it because it meant age. One line, the difference between a car boot pan and a 300-pound pan. I want to start there because everything else I'm going to tell you today comes back to that single idea. A physical mark left by a process. Something you can feel with your thumb in under 5 seconds, standing at a car boot table while someone's trying to sell you a packet of old curtain hooks. You don't need a price guide. You don't need a loop. You need to know what you're feeling for and why it matters. I've been picking cast iron for the better part of 40 years. Started properly in my late teens, trailing Uncle Derek around Wolverhampton Market on Saturday mornings. Derek worked a stall of mixed hardware and old fishing kit. Nothing glamorous, nothing especially organized, but he had an eye that I came to understand. Slowly was actually a system. He'd pick up something rusty, turn it over, run a finger across the base, and either set it aside or put it under the stall where the good stuff lived. I asked him once what he was doing. He said he was reading it. I thought that was a bit theatrical at the time. 40 years later, I know exactly what he meant. What I'm going to walk you through today is 10 specific pans, 10 real pieces I've either bought and sold myself or assessed at clearances for other people. Different makers, different ages, different conditions when found. Some were buried in rust. Some looked almost clean. One was sitting in a pile of aluminium camping gear like it had no idea what it was. But all 10 share something, a physical characteristic that places them above the ordinary. And I'll get to that at the end because naming it at the start would spoil the exercise. The exercise is the point. Let's begin with why cast iron keeps fooling people, because until you sort that out, you'll keep walking past the right things. Cast iron pans have a particular problem when it comes to being found in the wild, which is that they look terrible. Not all of them, but the ones worth finding usually do. They've been in a barn, or at the back of a garage, or in a box someone hasn't opened since 1987. They've got surface rust, which ranges from a light orange film to proper red-brown scale that flakes when you handle it. They might have old cooking residue baked on, grease turned dark and hard over decades of use. The handle might be rough. The base might have some soil dried onto it. By any casual visual standard, they look like something you'd put in the skip. That appearance is exactly why they're still there for you to find. Anyone who's been watching dealers work knows this. The cleaned-up piece, the pan that's been wire-wheeled and re-seasoned and priced at £30 on a nicely laid-out stall, that one's already been found. Somebody already knew what it was. The one that looks terrible is the one that's still in the game, still at the wrong price or no price at all, because the person selling it saw rust and thought junk. Uncle Derek's rule was, never sneer at rust. Rust means age, and age means value if you know what you're looking at. I didn't listen to that rule carefully enough early on, and it cost me a tray of Stanley 71 router planes I'd sold for £2 each before I understood what they were. That lesson was about tools, but it applies to cast iron just as directly. Rust is not a disqualifier. Rust is neutral at worst, a positive signal at best. Heavy rust, the type that has actually eaten into the metal, left pitting, created craters you can press your fingernail into, that slows things down but doesn't stop them. Pitted cast iron can still be restored and sold. It might knock 20% off a top price, but a pitted Griswold is still a Griswold. There is one surface condition that is a genuine disqualifier, and I'll name it now because I'd rather you knew it: a crack. A hairline fracture in the casting, sometimes running from the handle socket across the base, sometimes appearing as a thin, dark line through the cooking surface. Cast iron doesn't bend. When it fails by cracking, and a cracked pan is structurally compromised. It might still look impressive. It might carry a famous name on the base. But a cracked pan isn't restorable in any meaningful sense. It can't be used safely, and the collector market won't touch it at serious prices. The value drops to near zero for anything other than display in a certain sort of country kitchen aesthetic. Learn to check for cracks before you get attached to anything else. Pick the pan up, hold it towards the light, rotate it slowly. A crack usually shows because it's darker than the surface around it, and because it runs in a way that follows stress lines across the base, around the handle socket, through the thinnest sections. If you're unsure, tap it lightly with your knuckle. A sound pan rings. A cracked pan gives a dull thud. That's not a perfect test, but it catches most of them. Everything else, rust, muck, old seasoning, surface unevenness, is cosmetic. Work around it. Don't walk away from it. Back to the gate mark, because this is where the real conversation starts. If you turn a cast iron pan upside down and look at the base, you're looking at the part that was facing down in the mold when the iron was poured. In early foundry practice, up to around the 1890s in most British and American foundries, the iron was poured through a gate, a channel in the mold, that left a distinctive mark when the casting was removed. That mark is a thin raised line, usually running straight across the diameter of the base, sometimes slightly off-center, sometimes dead-center. It's not a crack. It's not damage. It's a seam where the pour channel was sanded down but never completely eliminated because that would have added cost and time. You feel for it with your thumb. Run your thumb across the base from edge to edge. If there's a gate mark, you'll feel a slight ridge, thin, maybe a millimeter proud of the surface, sometimes less. It's subtle. The first time someone shows it to you, you'll wonder how you missed it. After the third time, you won't miss it again. Gate marks place a pan firmly in the pre-1890 era, because after that, most foundries moved to side gate pouring, and then to bottom gate methods that didn't leave the same mark on the cooking surface side. The gate mark doesn't tell you who made the pan. It doesn't tell you which country it came from. What it tells you is that the pan is genuinely old, pre-Victorian end, for a properly centered top gate mark. And in the cast iron market, genuinely old is where the prices start climbing. A gated pan in decent condition, good casting, no cracks, reasonable surface, from an unidentified British foundry will fetch between £40 and £120 depending on size and how the casting sits. That's before you've identified a single maker's mark. If you find a gate mark and then turn it over to read a name you recognize, you've moved into a different conversation entirely. The gate mark confirms age. What it doesn't confirm is maker, and maker is what drives the top prices. So let's talk about the names. In Britain, the name you will encounter most often on genuinely collectible cast iron is Kenrick. Archibald Kenrick and Sons, West Bromwich, operating from 1791 through most of the 20th century. They were prolific. They made cooking pots, flat irons, door furniture, all manner of ironware, and their cooking pieces are found regularly in Midlands clearances, which makes sense given where they were based. I've turned up Kenrick pieces in clearance houses, at estate sales, once in a box lot at an auction in Telford that the auctioneer described simply as kitchen miscellany. Kenrick pieces are usually marked on the base with the name in relief lettering, raised, not stamped, along with a size number. The foundry used a system of numbers to indicate pan diameter, and knowing those numbers matters because the larger sizes, the 10s and 12s, command significantly more than the 4s and 5s. A Kenrick skillet in a size 10, good casting, gate mark, no cracks, you're looking at £80 to £150 retail, sometimes more if a specialist dealer gets hold of it. A size 4 in similar condition, £15 to £40. The other thing about Kenrick is the casting quality, which is where you develop your eye. Early Kenrick pieces, pre-1900, have noticeably thinner walls than the later production. Not thin in a fragile sense, but refined. The weight is right for the size in a way that later, heavier industrial castings aren't. You pick up an early Kenrick and it feels considered. That's the word I keep coming back to. Like someone thought about where the weight needed to be. Falkirk Ironworks pieces are less common in English clearances, but they surface, particularly in Scotland and the north of England. Falkirk was a major Scottish foundry, and their domestic ironware has a slightly different aesthetic. Heavier handles, rounder profiles on the skillets, that you come to recognize once you've handled a few. Falkirk pieces are generally in the same price bracket as mid-range Kenrick, though a large, well-preserved piece with a clear foundry mark will occasionally punch higher. Aga is a name that causes confusion. People hear Aga and think of the cooker, which of course is a 20th century product and not what we're talking about here. But Aga-branded cast iron cookware, made specifically to accompany the cooker, produced by the Swedish company and then by British licensees, has its own collector following, particularly the early pieces from the 1940s and 1950s. These are not the most valuable cast iron in the British market, but they're identifiable, they're attractive, and they move. A set of original Aga cast iron in good condition, lidded casserole, frying pan, griddle, can make £200 to £400 as a complete, matched set. Individual pieces less, obviously, but they still find buyers. There are other British names worth knowing. Coalbrookdale for decorative pieces, though their cooking ironware is rarer. Various smaller foundries whose marks you'll see on regional clearances without being able to identify them immediately. When you find an unknown mark, write it down or photograph it. There are reference resources, British Cast Iron Research Association, various collector forums, where identifications get made. An unidentified mark that turns out to be a known foundry is worth the 20 minutes of research. But here's where British iron, as collectible and findable as it is, runs into a ceiling. The top prices in the British cast iron market, the pieces selling for £300, £400, £500 and occasionally more, are being driven not by British foundries, but by American ones, which requires an explanation, because the obvious question is why American cast iron is turning up in British barns at all. The answer is straightforward once you think about it. People moved. Throughout the 20th century, and particularly in the post-war decades, there was substantial movement between Britain and North America. Emigration, military presence, commercial ties, returning families. A British family that spent time in the United States brought things back. An American serviceman who married locally left things behind when a household was eventually cleared. Cast iron is heavy and durable and doesn't get thrown away easily. It gets put in the back of a cupboard, moved into the garage when the kitchen gets modernized, ends up in a box in a barn when the house changes hands. This is why, in 30-odd years of working car boots and clearances from Shropshire to Lincolnshire, I have found American cast iron in places it has no obvious business being. A Griswold skillet in a farmhouse clearance near Ludlow, a Wagner ware pan in a box lot from a house in Derby. These pieces didn't get there by magic. Someone carried them across an ocean, and then time and inattention hid them until a clearance. Griswold Manufacturing, Erie, Pennsylvania. That's the name that moves markets. Griswold operated from 1865 to 1957. And over that period, they changed their logo several times, and those logo changes are the key to valuation. This is where it gets specific, because the difference between logo variants on the same basic skillet can be the difference between £30 and £300. The earliest Griswold pieces, pre-1900, often carry minimal or no logo, just the Erie, PA mark, and a size number. These are collectible on age alone. From around 1900 to 1920, Griswold used a large block logo, the word Griswold in capital letters within a stylized cross mark. This is the variant that collectors chase hardest. Large block logo Griswold, good condition, no cracks. The value depends on size, but a number 8 skillet in this variation can make £200 to £400 in the British market. More if it's a rare size. From the 1920s onward, Griswold used what's called the small block logo, same cross mark but smaller lettering. These are more common, still valuable, but a step below the large block variants. After the company changed hands in the 1940s and 1950s, quality dropped noticeably, and the collector premium drops with it. So you're reading the logo not just for the name, but for the era within the name. Wagner Ware, Sydney, Ohio, operating from the 1890s through to eventual acquisition, sits slightly below Griswold in terms of ceiling price, but is still serious money for the right pieces. Wagner's early skillets, pre-1920, are particularly well regarded for casting quality. The Wagner Ware mark, in its various early iterations, is what you're looking for on the base, along with a size number and sometimes a pattern number. A good early Wagner in a working size will fetch £80 to £200. Not Griswold territory, but not nothing. Lodge is the American name that most often causes confusion, because Lodge is still manufacturing cast iron today, and they've been doing it since 1896. A Lodge skillet from 1910 and a Lodge skillet from 2015 are both marked Lodge. The difference is legible in the casting. Early Lodge pieces have the same machined cooking surface and consistent wall thickness as the other quality foundries. Later production is thicker and heavier and finished differently. But if someone has cleaned up an early Lodge and isn't being forthcoming about its age, you need to read the casting rather than the name. I'll come back to how you do that. There are also reproduction pieces, Griswold logos copied onto Chinese castings, new pans distressed to look old, and I'll deal with those specifically later. For now, the point is that American iron in British clearances is a real phenomenon. It appears more often than people expect, and the price differential between knowing and not knowing what you're holding is substantial. Right, the 10 pans. I'm going to take these in the order I think about them, not strictly by value, because the value isn't really the lesson. The identification process is. The first pan I want to describe is a number 8 skillet, found in a barn clearance in South Shropshire about 6 years ago. The clearance was from an old farmhouse, 3 generations of accumulated tools and kitchen equipment. The pan was in a tin crate with some old horseshoe nails and a broken hacksaw. Surface rust across the whole cooking face. Moderate, the orange film type, not the pitting type. Base had soil dried on it. Handle felt solid, no wobble. I turned it over and ran my thumb across the base before I read the mark. Gate mark, clear and continuous, running just off-center. Then I found the mark itself. Griswold, large block, Erie, PA, size 8. I paid £3 for it as part of the crate. Cleaned and sold 8 months later for £220. The gate mark placed it pre-1890s production. The large block logo confirmed the desirable era, and the casting quality, thin walls, flat base, machined cooking surface, confirmed it was genuine early production rather than a later piece someone had tried to make look older. The second pan, a Kenrick skillet, size 10, found in a house clearance in Wolverhampton, which felt appropriate given my history with the area. This one had been used recently, or recently in relative terms. There was baked-on residue across the cooking surface, thick and dark. The base was cleaner, and the Kenrick mark was clear. The name in relief, size number 10, a small foundry symbol I've come to recognize as mid to late Victorian production. No gate mark on this one. The casting style, and the mark placed it around 1895 to 1910, after the gate mark era, but still early enough to qualify as the good stuff. Paid £5. Sold for 110. The size was the key there. A size 10 Kenrick doesn't come up as often as the smaller pieces, and buyers know that. The third pan is the one that always gets the most interest when I tell the story. It's a Wagner Ware number 9, a less common size, found in a box at a car boot in Oswestry, sitting in a carrier bag with an old tin opener and some jam jar lids. The seller wanted £1 for the lot. The pan was cleanish, actually. Someone had wiped it down at some point, which is why it didn't immediately register as old. But when I turned it over, there was the Wagner Ware mark in its early script form, the flat base, the machined surface. The walls were notably thin. Pre-1920 piece, I was fairly sure. Paid the £1, sold for 145. The number 9 size is less common than the 8, and serious Wagner collectors know that. Fourth pan, a Falkirk piece, found at an estate sale near Carlisle. Unusual to find Falkirk that far south, but the family had Scottish roots, which explained it. This was a deep skillet, more of a small casserole form, with the Falkirk foundry name cast into the base, along with a decorative border mark I hadn't seen before on a Falkirk piece. I photographed it and looked it up later. It turned out to be a specific production run from the 1870s that Falkirk made for a regional merchant. The gate mark was there, clearly. Paid £12, it looked more impressive than a lot of the rusty pieces, and the seller had some idea it was old. Sold for 180 to a Scottish collector who specifically wanted it for the merchant mark. Fifth pan, This is the lodge question I mentioned earlier. A lodge skillet, number 8, found at a car boot in Stafford. It looked the part. Surface rust. Old handle. Sat flat. The lodge mark on the base was clear, but something about the weight didn't sit right when I picked it up. It was heavier than an early lodge should be. The walls weren't as refined, and the cooking surface had a slight roughness that isn't characteristic of the pre-1930 production. I passed on it at £3. Had it been early lodge, it would have been worth 40 to 80. As a mid-century or later piece, it's a user, not a collector piece, worth a fiver to someone who wants to cook on cast iron, which is a perfectly fine outcome, just not the outcome I'm looking for. That decision, pass on this one, was made in about 30 seconds, based entirely on feel. I'll explain exactly what I felt and didn't feel when I get to the shared characteristic at the end. Sixth pan. A Griswold small block logo, number 6, found in a deceased estate clearance in Telford. I mention Telford specifically because I've had a lot of luck in Telford clearances over the years. There's a clearance house there I've been using for a long time, and the staff know to call me when cast iron comes in, which is a relationship worth building anywhere you work regularly. This one was in good shape. Some surface rust, but no pitting. Clear mark. Flat base. Small block logo places it 1920s to 1940s. Paid £8 at the clearance house. They'd done some research and priced it up a bit. Sold for 95. The small block doesn't hit the same ceiling as the large block, but a genuine small block Griswold in a working size is still a solid find. Seventh pan. A piece that almost fooled me, which I include for honesty. At a car boot near Market Drayton, I found what looked, at first handling, like a very promising early piece. Gate mark present, flat base, reasonable weight distribution. The mark on the base was a name I didn't immediately recognize, which isn't unusual. But something felt off about the gate mark itself. It was too even, too consistent, running with a perfection that genuine gate marks don't quite have. Genuine gate marks are slightly irregular because they were hand-finished. This one felt cast rather than finished, if you follow me. It was a reproduction, and the gate mark was part of the reproduction. I put it down. The seller wanted £25 for it, which would have been a bad £25. A cast reproduction gate mark is the kind of detail you only catch once you've felt enough genuine ones to know what irregular actually feels like. Eighth pan. A pre-1900 British piece, no legible maker's mark. Found at an auction in Shrewsbury. A box lot that went for £4, including a butter churn lid, 3 horseshoes, and a length of old chain. The pan was at the bottom of the box. No name I could read, but the gate mark was unmistakable. The casting was refined in the way early British foundry work is, and the size, a large number 12 equivalent, made it interesting. I sold it as an identified era, unidentified maker piece, which is a category that exists in the market. £105. The casting quality and the scale were the argument, and a buyer agreed. Ninth pan. An Aga cast iron skillet, mid-1940s production. Found in a kitchen clearance near Ludlow, the house had an original Aga cooker still in it, which is why the matching cast iron was there. Pieces that come with provenance, original context, original cooker, tend to move more easily. This one was clean, well-maintained, with the Aga mark clear on the base. The cooking surface had the machined finish I'll describe shortly. Sold with 2 other matching Aga pieces as a partial set for 160 for the 3. Not the most spectacular result, but a good afternoon's work. 10th pan, the one I'm most pleased about finding, and I've saved it for last deliberately. A Griswold large block, Erie, PA, number 3. The number 3 is a small pan, about 17 centimeters across, and it might not look like much sitting in a pile of car boot miscellany. Small pans often get overlooked. People assume bigger means more valuable, which is sometimes true in cast iron, but absolutely not always true. Certain small Griswold sizes are scarcer than the mid-range pieces because fewer were made and fewer survive in good condition. The number 3 in large block variant is one of those. Found in a charity shop in Shrewsbury for £1.50. Sold for 180. £1.50 to 180 on a pan that fits in one hand. That's the cast iron market when you know what you're reading. Now, the thing all 10 of those pans have in common, or 9 of them technically because I excluded the mid-century lodge from this category deliberately. 9 of the 10 pans I've described share a physical characteristic that is legible by touch, takes under 10 seconds to assess, and separates foundry-quality cast iron from the mass-production pieces that came later. That characteristic is this: a machined cooking surface, consistent wall thickness, and a base that sits flat without any wobble. 3 things, but they function as one thing because they all come from the same manufacturing discipline. In the good foundry period, broadly the 1860s to the 1930s, with some variation by maker, quality cast iron was finished by hand after casting. The cooking surface, the inside of the pan, was ground smooth on a lathe or by hand finishing. Not polished to a mirror shine, but worked until it was genuinely smooth to the touch, the way a well-used granite surface feels, consistently flat with a slight drag to it. Run your fingertip across a quality foundry piece, and you feel that smoothness, that slight mechanical regularity that comes from being machined rather than just cast and left. Most post-war production, and all cheap production, skips this step. The cooking surface is left with the slight texture of the cast, a stippled, slightly rough surface that you can feel immediately against the machined finish of the older piece. This is why new Lodge and cheap reproductions feel different to early Lodge or Griswold or Kenrick. The name might be the same, the casting might look similar, but the surface tells you immediately which era it belongs to. The wall thickness works alongside this. Quality foundry work has consistent walls, even thickness from the base up through the sides. If you grip a pan around the outside of the cooking bowl and press with your fingers, you're feeling for consistency. Mass production and inferior casting produces walls that are slightly uneven, thicker in some places, thinner in others. You're not measuring this with instruments. You're feeling whether it feels right, which it does when it's consistent, and doesn't when it isn't. This is the thing that takes time to develop, but it comes faster than you'd expect. The flat base is the most immediately checkable. Put the pan on a flat surface and press gently on the rim. If it rocks, any rocking at all, the base is not flat. A genuinely flat-based foundry piece sits absolutely still. Warped bases happen when pans are heated incorrectly, particularly on modern flat-top cookers, and a warped base is a mark against condition, though it doesn't necessarily ruin a sale for a collector piece. But the flat base is what the best pieces have, and it's the first thing I check after the gate mark and the maker's mark. Machined surface, consistent wall, flat base. Those 3 things, felt rather than seen, are the signature of the pieces that were made when people cared enough about the process to finish them properly. This is what the mid-century Lodge didn't have. The weight was there. The name was there. The surface texture told me it was a later production piece, and the walls confirmed it. 30 seconds, and a 3-pound decision not made. Now let's talk about the things that mimic this, because knowing what to look for is only half the job. The other half is knowing what's trying to look like what you're looking for. The reproduction market for cast iron is real, and it's active. Griswold is the most heavily copied name, for obvious reasons. The price premium is high enough to make reproduction worthwhile, and the logo is distinctive enough that it gives buyers confidence they're looking at something genuine. What reproducing foundries have learned is that casting the logo accurately is relatively easy. What they haven't fully solved, and where the genuine article always wins, is the machined surface. A reproduction Griswold, almost without exception, has that slightly stippled cooking surface that marks post-war production. It might have a gate mark cast in, as I described with the Market Drayton piece, but it won't have the machine-finished surface, and it won't have the perfectly consistent wall thickness, because achieving those things requires the finishing steps that made the originals expensive to produce in the first place. You can copy the logo in 5 minutes. You cannot fake 40 minutes of hand finishing in a Victorian foundry. The other category is genuine old pans from lower-value foundries. There were dozens of British and American foundries making cast iron cookware, and not all of them were working at the same quality level. A pan that has a gate mark, reasonable casting, and a name you don't recognize might be from a mid-tier foundry that produced serviceable but not exceptional work. These pieces are old, they're authentic, but they don't carry the collector premium of the named quality foundries, and they shouldn't. An unidentified mark and ordinary casting quality puts a piece in the £20 to £50 range for a decent example, not the £150 to £300 range of the quality names. The distinction between these and the top-tier pieces is the machined surface and wall consistency, which the quality foundries prioritized, and the mid-tier foundries often didn't. There are also genuine Griswold and Wagner pieces that have been reconditioned badly. Someone has wire-wheeled the cooking surface too aggressively, or reseasoned with the wrong material, or stored it improperly after cleaning in a way that's caused flash rust to set into the cooking surface. These are real pieces with reduced value. The logo is right, the casting is right, but the surface has been damaged in restoration. Worth knowing because you might be offered a genuinely old piece that's been worked over, and pricing that correctly, lower than a well-preserved example, higher than you'd pay for a reproduction, is part of operating in this market. The test I learned from a dealer in Shrewsbury who's been working cast iron longer than I have, and I'll tell you his name is Mick, though I doubt he'd thank me for the publicity, is this: close your eyes and run the tip of your index finger slowly across the cooking surface of the pan from the edge toward the center. On a quality machined piece, your finger travels smoothly, with a faint mechanical drag, and comes to rest at the center feeling the same surface it started on. On a modern or reproduction piece, your finger travels over a slightly rough, stippled surface that you can actually hear as a faint scratching sound against the roughness. On a damaged or over-restored piece, you'll feel irregularity, rougher in some places, smoother in others, the telltale of uneven mechanical treatment. 3 seconds, eyes closed, one finger. Mick's been doing it for 30 years, and I've been doing it since he showed me, and I have not once found it to be wrong. The surface doesn't lie. So here's where we land, and this is the thing I want you to carry away. All 10 of those pans, the Griswold large block in the barn, the Kenrick size 10 in Wolverhampton, the Wagner in the carrier bag in Oswestry, the Falkirk with the merchant mark, the unidentified British 12, the Aga set in Ludlow, the small Griswold 3 from the charity shop. All of them were made in an era when finishing the cooking surface was considered part of making the object properly, when consistent walls were a standard to be met, not a cost to be avoided, when a base that sat flat was the expected outcome, not a quality feature to be charged extra for. That era ended roughly between 1920 and 1960, depending on the maker and the country. The processes that made it possible were slower and more expensive, and cheaper production methods won, as cheaper production methods tend to. What that means for you, standing at a car boot table or going through a barn clearance, is that those physical characteristics, the machined surface, the consistent wall, the flat base, are the signatures of a manufacturing moment that has passed. You cannot get them in new production. You can only find them on old pieces, and old pieces are out there, in barns and charity shops and box lots and car boots, waiting for someone who knows what they're feeling for. The rust is irrelevant. Rust tells you the piece has been somewhere, which usually means it's been around long enough to be interesting. The name helps. A Griswold or a Kenrick or a Wagner will fetch more than an unidentified foundry of equivalent quality, because that's how collector markets work. But the name is not the whole story. The casting is the whole story. The casting tells you whether the name is genuine. The casting tells you whether the piece deserves serious consideration before you look at anything else. The casting is everything. The 3-point touch test, flat base first. Put it on a hard surface. Press gently on the rim. If it rocks, note that it's relevant. Then run your thumb across the cooking surface. You're feeling for smoothness, for that slight mechanical drag of a machined surface, not the stippled roughness of cast and left production. Then grip the cooking bowl around the outside and feel the wall consistency. Even and considered means quality. Irregular and uneven means look harder before you commit. 10 seconds. You can do it while appearing to merely be looking at the pan, which is generally the right approach at a car boot, when you don't want to explain yourself to someone who then decides their rusty old pan is suddenly worth £50. If you've got a piece at home, something from a shed clearance, an inheritance, something that's been at the back of the cupboard, go and get it out and try this now. Then tell me in the comments what it is, what you paid for it, and what you think it might actually be worth. I'm particularly interested in anything with a mark you can't identify, because sometimes those are the most interesting ones. Next time, I'm taking you through a single morning at a clearance house in Shropshire. 3 finds, all of which will make a lot more sense now that you've sat through this one. One of them has a mark that took me 2 weeks to identify. Worth the 2 weeks.